How's everyone doing today? Good? Good. I'm doing great. I was spent most of the day up in Silver City in the operating room and just barely got into town, so I'm good. Cool. Well, I think what we're going to do is this is our first lecture, so we're going to go ahead and go over Chapter 1, hopefully get through most of Chapter 2. So hopefully you guys have kind of read ahead and you're at least familiarized with the material. Chapter 1 should be really familiar with you guys. And again, these first two chapters, I'm not going to do any PowerPoints at all. Chapter 1 is, at this point, just going to be filling in some gaps since we covered a good majority of the material in the first lab. There's a really good crossover there, so at least we're primed for Chapter 1 material. Okay, so let me just review a couple of things with you guys. So let me throw this question out here. What's the difference between anatomy and physiology?
Anatomy, structure, and physiology is function.
Structure and function. There you go. All right. Try not to be late again, because I tend to just keep that door closed, and you'll have to wait till the break. I don't like interrupting class. Okay, thanks. All right, so anatomy versus physiology, structure versus function. So when we talk about anatomy, there are different sub-levels or different disciplines within anatomy. So when we look at structures that we can visualize with the naked eye, okay, unaided, we don't need a microscope. What do we generally call that type of anatomy?
Gross anatomy.
That's gross anatomy. Good. All right. And then when we look at structures that are smaller than the naked eye can perceive, we call that microscopic. Cool. All right, microscopic. Now, under the umbrella of microscopic anatomy, we have some other subtypes. When we're looking at the individual cells themselves, and we're studying individual cells, we call that what? Cytology. Good. Now, when we're looking at tissues rather than cells, we call that histology. Good. All right. Cool. Now, under gross anatomy, there are a couple of things. There's anatomical, and we're looking at certain anatomical features. There's functional, there's structural. Okay, we can even look at large types of organ systems and those kinds of things, and that should be fairly self-evident there. The big words you want to focus in on are going to be cytology and histology, and we'll be doing individual labs on these two concepts alone. Your lab on Thursday will be covering cytology, or the study of cells, tissues. Now, when we talk about physiology, okay, when things go wrong, okay, when physiology goes wrong, and we study that, when we study physiology going wrong, what is the word that's used? Pathophysiology. Patho means a dysfunction or disease, so pathophysiology would be the study of the dysfunction of normal physiology. You guys all okay with that? So in this class, we're going to focus more on looking at the normal structure and the normal function. That will be our primary goal. Okay, we want to know how stuff looks and functions normally, and then once we develop an intuition for how stuff functions normally, how it looks normally, then we can begin to talk about the dysfunction and how stuff breaks down. You guys okay with that? All right, cool. So now that's okay. Wait till break. All right. So let's just keep going on. Let's talk about the two underlying themes that kind of recur throughout anatomy and physiology. And one of those themes we talked about in lab, it has to do with structure, and you guys remember that saying? It was kind of a rule of thumb. Something follows something. There you go. So the first underlying concept is form follows function. Or function follows form. You could alternatively say that. Oh, I see it. All right. So when we're looking at something, I think I gave the example of we're looking at some sort of cell and it looks like that cell may be able to move or perhaps contract. Okay. Maybe there's some proteins in that cell that look like they could move or pull or contract. That informs us as to what that cell may do. Maybe that is a muscle cell or it's in muscle tissue. So we see this time and time again. The other underlying concept that we run into in anatomy and physiology is a concept known as homeostasis. Homeostasis. All right. What is homeostasis? That's kind of a long word, sounds kind of complicated, but what is it? What is it fundamentally?
A constant internal environment.
Yeah. So a biological organism, okay, be that a single-celled organism or multi-celled organism like us, okay, so if you have the organism and the organism lives in an environment, what do we know about the conditions within that organism? The conditions within the organism, are they about the same or are they generally going to be different from the environment around the organism? The same? Well, think about me as you guys look at me and you imagine the inside of my body. Is the inside of my body, is it the same or different as all this outside? It's pretty different, isn't it? So I have a complex, okay, I have an internal environment that is different than the external environment. And the homeostasis, what it is it's a bunch of things happening, okay? It's the organism attempting to maintain a stable internal environment. That's fundamentally what homeostasis is. Okay, stable, relatively constant internal environment. Now, when things come along and perturb that stable environment, okay, cause problems, that's where we get into pathophysiology, things going wrong. Okay, so anytime I have an alteration of homeostasis, okay, an alteration of homeostasis is going to result in some sort of disease state. Okay, if I get my leg cut off, for example, and I lose a lot of blood, is that going to potentially alter my stable internal environment? What do you guys think? Yeah, it's potentially going to alter my stable internal environment. Cool. If I get too hot or if I get too cold, could that alter my internal environment?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, cool. So these are the two primary underlying broad concepts that really go into anatomy and physiology: form and function and the concept of homeostasis. And everything that we talk about from here on out will relate to these, okay? We're studying all the cells, the tissues, the organs, organ systems, etc. We're studying how these work together to maintain that stable internal environment. You guys okay with that? So far, so good? Cool. All right, so let's move on to just a quick review of some basic anatomical terms. Make sure you guys are good. So what's the anatomical position?
Standing erect facing forward.
All right.
Palms.
Palms out. Good. All right, just like that. Okay, what surface is this? Anterior or ventral. And then what surface would this be? Posterior or dorsal. Cool. All right. Now, when I talk about my extremities particularly, okay, where is the point of attachment of my extremities? Where do they attach? Okay, so my upper extremities attach to the trunk of the body, the core of the body here, the shoulders, and then here are my hips, okay? Now, when I am talking about some structure that is toward where an extremity attaches to the body, we say that structure is what? Proximal, right? So if I look at my wrist versus my elbow, my wrist would be what to my elbow? It would be distal to my elbow would be proximal to the wrist. You guys okay with that? So proximal is away from point of attachment, proximal is toward the point of attachment, distal is away. You guys okay with that? So that's proximal versus distal. We also have the concept of medial and lateral. And with medial and lateral, what you have to do is, as the body's standing like this, you have to imagine, you draw an imaginary line that cuts the body exactly into a right and a left half. Okay, we call that, what is that line known as? The midline or the mid-sagittal line. Okay, the midline or the mid-sagittal line. Now, if there is a structure that is closer to the midline of the body, we say that that structure is medial. And if that structure is away from the midline, we say that that structure is lateral. You guys okay with that? So if I compare, let's say that I compare my sternum, okay, I compare my sternum to my ear. My sternum would be what to my ear? Medial to my ear. You guys okay with that? Yeah, you did the lab, so of course you're okay with that. All right. Other terms, superior versus inferior. Okay, so a structure that is superior is going to be where? It's going to be up, and a structure that is inferior is going to be lower, right? So my liver would be what to my heart? Inferior to my heart. You guys okay with that? So I've got superior, inferior, all right? And then there's also a term, some people use it, it's called caudal. C-A-U-D-A-L. And caudal is somewhat like inferior, but not quite. So when you hear that term caudal, that means toward the tailbone, or what's the proper name for the tailbone? The coccyx. Yeah, toward the coccyx. So you may hear that. It's a bit more of an esoteric term, but we'll throw that out there just to make sure you guys are good. You guys okay with that? All right, cool. The next thing that I want to talk about real quick before I go into some more of the new material is I want to talk about dividing the body into anatomical planes. So let me get rid of all this stuff here. Okay, I'm just going to keep it super simple so I'm not spending all day drawing here. So we'll just use our little stick guy here. Okay, so we've got our stick guy, right? Now what we can do is we can cut that individual into different planes or different sections. You guys okay with that? So if I were to come along and I were to cut that guy right down the midline, okay, so I were to cut right down the midline, all right, and I were to cut him in right and left halves, okay, and then I were to look at that right or that left half, we would call that what?
Sagittal.
That would be a sagittal. You guys okay with that? That would be a sagittal section. Now, occasionally, I may make a cut right, left in different areas other than in the midline, right? For example, a very common line is what we call the mid-clavicular line. Where's the clavicle? What bone? The clavicle is the collarbone, right? So the mid-clavicular line is a line, okay, that goes through the clavicle. So that's not right along the midline, but it's oriented in the same direction, right? So if I have another line that is alongside the sagittal, what would we call that particular section? A parasagittal. Yeah. Para means alongside. That's why you guys are familiar with a health professional known as a paramedic, right? And medic means doctor. And so a paramedic is someone who works alongside the doctor. Does that kind of make sense? Why we have that term? Okay, cool. So I've got a sagittal section, okay, and then I've got a parasagittal section. All right. Okay. Let's talk about another view, and it's going to be hard to draw here. But imagine that instead of cutting me in a left and right, instead I get cut in front back. Okay, my anterior, the anterior part of my body gets cut away from the posterior. And I just think of horror movies. I think there's this movie called 13 Ghosts, and this guy walks in front of this glass thing, and it comes up and cuts him in half, and the front of his body falls off, and the back of his body falls off, right? That is what I'm asking you. What kind of section have we created there? A frontal or a coronal. Yeah, a frontal or coronal section. You guys okay with that? Mm-hmm. All right. And then finally, I can cut through like this. Okay, I could cut somebody in half like this, a superior-inferior cut. And that would be what kind of section? Transverse. You guys okay with that? So those are the major sections. This is really important. Anybody here planning on going into X-ray technology? X-ray? Okay, you guys got to know this. You'll have to know this stuff dead cold, because when we look at doing X-rays or nuclear medicine or MRIs or any type of imaging modality, those images are going to take sections. We're going to be looking at sections. For example, if I do a CAT scan or CT scan of somebody's head, okay, it's going to look at slices of the head, little 5 millimeter slices of the head in this direction. So what kind of slices would I be looking at? What kind of sections would I be looking at? Transverse, right? Okay. Others maybe other views or other planes. But you guys okay with that? All right, cool. Well, then let's just move on. We've basically gotten all that major stuff out of the way. Looking good. All right. So what I want to do now, real quick, is I want to talk about some of the major mechanisms. Okay, nothing specific, but major broad mechanisms involved in maintaining homeostasis. Okay, and they fall into one of two major categories, and these are what we call feedback loops. Okay, they can either fall into what we call positive feedback, all right, or negative feedback. And those of you that did your reading, you should be able to tell me which one is overwhelmingly more common in the human body, positive or negative feedback. Because I know you all did your reading like I asked, right? What's that? Yeah, negative feedback is overwhelmingly the most common type of feedback. And negative feedback works as follows, and I'll give you an example. And I think it's the example they use in the book, and it's a quintessential example. Okay? So I have some sort of receptor, some sort of biological receptor, okay, in my body that recognizes temperature. It senses temperature. And it senses that the temperature in my body is decreasing. And that receptor is going to send a signal, typically to the brain, all right, into the thermostat. And coincidentally, does anyone know where the thermostat of your body is? What part of the brain regulates your temperature? The hypothalamus. Good. Hypothalamus, deep within the brain. Actually, I believe I have the nervous system with you guys this semester, so we'll talk about that in more gory detail. Okay, and then what the brain does is the brain sends out, okay, information to what are called effectors. Okay, these may be blood vessels. They could be, in the case of a low temperature, where is most of your body heat produced? Skeletal muscles. Yeah, skeletal muscle. And what happens to those muscles? What do they do when you start getting cold? They start shivering, right? They start shivering, and they start producing heat. Okay, so the brain sends information to those effectors. They are acted upon, and what do? They produce heat. And when the temperature increases to a sufficient level, okay, what happens to that receptor when the temperature then increases? What happens to the receptor?
It sends the message to the brain.
Yeah, or it quits sending the message to the brain. It shuts itself off. Does that make sense? That's what I mean by negative feedback. Once that corrective action is taken and it works, it has a self-limiting mechanism built into it. And a more practical way of looking at that might be, what happens when you sit in your car and you turn that thing on? Those of you that have a vehicle that's made within the last 20 years or so.
Tell them to put your seatbelt.
Yeah, you get that ding, 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 right? Everybody knows that, right? Ding, ding. Think of that as a receptor in the brain, okay? Ding, 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 ding. And what happens once you put your seatbelt in? It stops and it turns itself off. That is actually an example of a negative feedback loop. Now, positive feedback is a little more interesting, but a positive feedback isn't necessarily corrective. It is it continues to make itself go more and more and more. And we see positive feedback, it's not seen as commonly because positive feedback tends to get out of hand very quickly. And some examples of positive feedback might be, a rumor. Oh, I heard this. Oh, I heard this. And then everybody starts, oh, I heard this, and this. And it just gets out of control, right? That might be a positive feedback. A stampede, for example. A big old cattle, I don't know if you guys have ever seen that or not. Big old cattle stampede where everything just gets terrified, and then it just kind of becomes really chaotic. Now, in some cases, we might want positive feedback. For example, if maybe we're really cold, or there's some really quick corrective action that needs to be taken immediately. But in general, negative feedback loops are what kind of rule the day because they have that self-limiting mechanism. They have that built-in, okay, I recognize the problem's fixed, let's shut this thing off. Does that make sense? Positive feedback is a bit more tricky there. Okay, cool. So we're good on positive feedback, we're good on negative feedback. Do you guys have any questions over anything that we've covered so far? Are you guys doing okay? Awesome, right? So this anatomy physiology stuff isn't so hard after all, is it? All right. Well, what I want to do now is I want to kind of go ab initio. Anyone remember what ab initio means? So ab initio is just a fancy word that means from first principles. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at just everything that we know about everything at this point. And we're going to start, okay, from the basic building blocks, and we're going to work our way up, okay? And in anatomy and physiology, the basic building block of an organism is what? Not even the cell. Atoms, yeah. So the basic building block, okay, and these are, and there's like a really nice, like 2 full-page kind of picture of this in your book. But these are the organizations, okay? This is the organization of life. And we generally say that life starts at the atomic or the chemical level. Now, couldn't we go even more fundamental than atoms? Are atoms all that there are, so to speak, when it comes to matter? Yeah, we actually have atoms are composite. And when I say something's composite, that just means that it's composed or it's made up of more fundamental things. So atoms themselves are made up of smaller particles known as electrons, protons, and neutrons. And is that the end of the story? Or is there even more fundamental level of structure?
Electrical charge.
Well, electrical charge is a property of protons and electrons specifically. But believe it or not, the protons and the neutrons within the atoms are made up of even more fundamental particles known as quarks. And then there are forces that hold those quarks together. And so if you were to look, well, we can't really look at it, but when we study protons and neutrons, we find that they are actually made up of 3 quarks. There are 3 quarks in a proton, 3 quarks in a neutron, and then those quarks are held together by something known as strong nuclear force. And it's mediated by a particle known as a gluon. And as far as we know, as far as we have found, quarks and electrons seem to be the most fundamental particles of matter, okay? And when I say matter, what I mean by matter is anything that has mass and it takes up space. So when we talk about light, for example, light doesn't have mass. It doesn't take up space, so it's not really matter, although light can be converted to matter. And you guys are maybe familiar with E equals mc squared, right? Everybody's heard of that, right? What does that mean? E equals mc squared, that's...
Energy equals mass times acceleration.
Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. So what what this does is this actually allows me to convert between something with mass and something with pure energy. So believe it or not, Light, for example, okay, if I had high enough energy light, I could potentially make particles, make mass with that. And mass could be converted into pure energy. And we see this with like nuclear bombs, for example. When a nuclear bomb goes off, okay, the nuclear material undergoes fission, and massive amounts of energy are released, a lot of it in the form of light, really high energy in light waves. And so I like to think of a little way that I remember it is mass. Anything with mass, all mass is frozen energy. It's basically frozen energy. When energy kind of freezes out, you get mass, and then when mass kind of melts, if you will, you get energy. So it's kind of complicated, and you're not going to have to know any of the math or anything like that. But just know that we can get more fundamental than the atomic level, but it's not as helpful for anatomy and physiology. It's not helpful for us to look at quarks and to look at gluons and to look at the strong nuclear force and to look at these more fundamental things, because they don't really help us solve the problems that we need to in this particular class, although studying that stuff has definitely helped us solve lots and lots of different problems. Again, I'll go back to you X-ray tech people. There is a type of imaging that actually involves using something known as antimatter. How crazy is that, right? Antimatter. And have you guys ever heard of a PET scan? PET scan is a positron emission tomography. PET scans use actually a particle, and it's called an anti-electron or a positron. A positron is an anti-electron. And what happens is when antimatter and matter meet, they annihilate each other and they release a lot of energy. They release pure energy. And so what you do is you have these positron, you inject a medication in somebody, and it causes positrons to be released. Those positrons collide with electrons, and then high energy light is released, and the scanner detects that light. And so that's how a PET scan works. So crazy, right? So there certainly is more we can go into detail, but I just can't in this course. Okay, so atoms are the fundamental building block of matter that's stable. Okay? Atoms are the fundamental building block of matter that is in a stable state. Okay, you can work with them. Now, atoms can combine to form what? To form molecules. Okay, so molecules are the result of combining one or more atoms. And then molecules can go on to form what? Many, many, many molecules eventually can form a... No, those are molecules. Proteins are molecules. Carbohydrates are molecules. So, cells. There we go. Yeah. All right. Cells. And then two or more cells form... Yeah, tissues, right? Tissues. All right. And then two or more tissue types form organs. All right. And then two or more organs form organ systems. And then organ systems ultimately form the organism. There we go. Or the human body, the organism. And then we can look at that backwards. So the organism is made of organ systems. Organ systems are made of organs. Organs are made of tissues. Tissues are made of cells. Cells are made of molecules. Molecules are made of atoms. You guys cool with that? Does that kind of make sense? This is the organization of life. So what we're going to do in anatomy and physiology, ab initio, from first principles, we're going to start fundamental, and then we're going to work our way up. So today, for the rest of this class period, unless you guys have any questions about chapter 1, which hopefully don't because it's a pretty straightforward, the rest of the day we are going to talk about chemistry. And chemistry is the study of chemicals, or ultimately is the study of atoms, their properties, and how they can bond to form molecules and how they can break apart. You guys okay with that? So we'll start there today. and we'll talk about molecules as well today. And then on Thursday and next week, we'll go into cells. And then the week after that, we'll go into tissues. And then we'll finally go into the more broad concepts. You guys okay with that? All right. How about you take, let's take 5 minutes. Hit the bathroom real quick if you need to. It's just up the hall here. We'll take a little 5-minute break, and then we'll roll right into chemistry. I'll do that for about an hour, and then give you guys like a good little 10-minute break, and then we'll do the final hour of class. Hopefully we can get through most of this chemical stuff.